The Introduction to the Old Testament, and Unit 15, The Divided Kingdom, from 850 to 722, which will be the end of the Northern Kingdom. Now, in the last unit, we talked about Elijah and Elisha, and now we're going to start with the ministry of Elisha. He performed many miracles. They're not of the same type as Elijah, and there are some people who count the number of miracles and say, see, he had twice as much of the Spirit of the Lord as Elijah did. No, you don't count miracles that way. He has the Spirit of Elijah on him, the same Spirit. And we read in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 19, the men of the city said to Elisha, "Look, our Lord, this town is well situated, as you can see, but the water is bad, and the land is unproductive. Bring me a new bowl," he said, "and put salt in it." So they brought it to him. He went to the spring, threw the salt into it, saying, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." And then we have a summary statement. The water has remained wholesome to this day, according to the word Elisha had spoken. In verse 23, it says that Elisha went up to Bethel, and as he was walking along, there are some teenagers that come out and begin to ridicule him and say, go up, you bald head." And it says that he turned around, looked at them, called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. And he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there returned to Samaria. In chapter 4, there is the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a little oil." So Elisha told her to gather up all of the jars that you can find in the community and take them into your home, and then pour the oil into the jars. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." So that is another miracle performed by Elisha. In verse 8, one day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. So whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, "I know that this man who often comes our way is a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put in it a bed and a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. Then he can stay there whenever he comes to us." And so he came and he mentioned to his servant Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite." He asked, "What can I do for you? Can I speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army?" She replied, "I have a home among my own people." So Elijah wants to know what he can do. And the servant then says, "She has no son, and her husband is old. So Elisha calls her and says, "You will hold a son in your arms." "No, my lord," she objected. "Don't mislead your servant, O man of God." But the woman became pregnant, and the next year, about that same time, she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. And then the child grew and was out in the field with his father and complained about his head. So he was carried to his mother. The boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. So the woman has her husband saddle her donkey, and she goes to Elisha. And she says, when she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress." And then she asked, "Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" And so Elisha realizes what has happened, and he sent Gehazi with his staff and told him to go and put it on the boy's face. But she won't leave unless Elisha comes with her. So when he gets to the house, nothing has happened. In verse 32, the boy was lying dead on his couch. He went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. And he stretched himself out upon him. The boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room, and then got on the bed and stretched out upon him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. So he then gave him back to his mother. Then the next event is in verse 38. Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in that region. They were cooking some herbs, and somebody found a wild vine, and he cut it up and put it into the pot. And when they began to eat, they cried out, "O man of God, there is death in the pot," and they could not eat. So Elisha said, "Get some flour." He put it into the pot and said, "Serve it to the people to eat." And there was nothing harmful in the pot. In verse 42, a man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley bread baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. "Give it to the people to eat," Elisha said. "How can I set this before 100 men?" his servant asked. And he said, "Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says. They will eat and have some left over." Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. Notice that the Lord is doing in the Old Testament the same thing that Jesus will do in the New Testament. Miracles are the same, because it is the same God who does it all. In chapter 5 is an interesting account of Naaman, the commander of the king of Aram. He has leprosy. He has a young girl, an Israelite, who had been captured in a raid, and she is a servant to his wife, and she makes the comment, "Too bad that my master can't see the prophet in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." When the king learns of this, he sends a letter to the king of Israel asking him to heal Naaman of his leprosy. And the king feels that this is merely a pretext for war. Elisha hears of it and tells him to send him to him. In verse 9, Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." This is not what Naaman had expected. In fact, he tells us, "I thought he would come out, wave his arm, say something, and I would be healed." But his servants tell him, "If he had told you to do something great, you would have done it." And so he went to the Jordan, bathed 7 times in the Jordan, and was healed of his leprosy. Naaman then went back and wanted to pay him for this, but Elisha would not take anything. Even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any god but Yahweh." Now notice that we have here the idea that a king or a god is over a geographical area. Naaman is going to go back to Syria, and there is a different god who is worshipped. So he wants to take soil from Israel so he can stand on that soil, and Yahweh is God over that soil so he can worship him properly even though he is in Syria. And so this is what Elisha allows him to do. Now, after Naaman had left, then we have Gehazi, the servant. He is a little perturbed because Elisha didn't get anything from Naaman. So he runs after Naaman, and he says, "There are a couple of seminary students that just come, and they need some tuition and some food. Give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." And so Naaman gives him 2 talents and even has his servants carry it back to the foot of the hill where Gehazi lives. And when Gehazi came in, Elisha asked, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes, olive groves, vineyards, flocks, herds, or men servants and maid servants? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever." Notice here that Elisha is able to go other places. His spirit goes where he himself does not go. And he is able to see things that happen away from him. And we see this other places too, where the king of Syria sets up a trap. But the king is warned, don't go that way because the king of Syria is planning to attack you. The king of Syria wants to know who is betraying him. And his own men tell him, "It's this Elisha. He knows exactly what you say, even in your bedroom." And we'll talk about the attempt to take Elisha a little later, but there is at least one more miracle performed by Elisha in chapter 6. They are going out to take poles to make a new building. And one of them had borrowed an axe, and the iron axe head fell into the water, and it was borrowed. So the man of God asked in chapter 6, verse 6, "Where did it fall?" When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. "Lift it out," he said. Then the man reached out his hand and took it. Now I mentioned that Elisha had the ability to know what was going on elsewhere. And in chapter 6, verse 8, the king of Aram was at war with Israel. The king of Israel keeps being warned about going certain places. And so the king of Syria wants to know, where is Elisha? In verse 13, go, find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he is in Dothan. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. Now this is interesting. If Elisha knows what he says anywhere, he knows that he's going to send to Dothan to try to get him. But this is the way the text reads. And when the servant of Elisha got up the next morning, he saw the army with horses and chariots around the city, and he said, "Oh, my Lord, what shall we do?" "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." This is something that we need to be aware of. Not just the Old Testament, but this is true anywhere. What Elisha does is pray that the Lord will open the eyes of his servant. And when he does so, then he sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, if God can do it in the Old Testament, God can do it in the New Testament. We can put our confidence in God to take care of us. Elisha then prayed that God would blind this army, and he led them then to Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" But Elisha says, "No, feed them and send them home." And so Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. So something good was accomplished as a result of this. In chapter 6 and verse 24, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up and laid siege to Samaria. There was a great famine in the city. They ran out of food. A fourth of a cab of seed pods, and that is about a half a pint, sold for 5 shekels. And a woman mentions that she had killed and eaten her son, and the woman that was with her was supposed to give her son so they could eat him, and she's hidden him. Well, this is terrible when parents kill their own children because the famine is so severe. The king is going to go to Elisha, and when he finally comes to Elisha, Elisha says in chapter 7, verse 1, "About this time tomorrow, a seah of flour," that's about 7 quarts of flour, "will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley," and that is about 13 quarts of barley, "will sell for a shekel." Now we saw earlier that it was so bad that they were selling seed pods for 5 shekels. And so they wonder, how can this happen? There were 4 men that had leprosy at the entrance to the city gate, and they determined that they would go into the Assyrian army camp and ask for food. If they were killed, that's all right, because if they went into the city, they would die of starvation. So they went into the camp, didn't find anyone there, but they found a lot of loot. and they took and hid some of it, went back and took some more, and then they decided they needed to tell the king that the Syrian camp was empty. So they did this, and they thought maybe it was just a trap. So they sent some horses and chariots, and they went towards the Jordan River, but they didn't find anything. In verse 14, they selected 2 chariots with their horses. King sent them after the Aramean army. He commanded the drivers, go and find out what has happened. And all they found was equipment that had been dropped as the Aramean army fled home. In verse 16, the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, just as the Lord had said. But verse 17 tells us the king had put the officer on whose arms he leaned in charge of the gate. The people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to his house. Because this man had said, it can't happen. The officer had said, look, even if the Lord should put windows in the heavens, could this happen? And so Elisha had said that you'll see it, but you won't eat any of it. Now in chapter 8, we read about the Shunammite whose son had been restored to life. She is mentioned here because Gehazi had been telling the king about the exploits of Elisha. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines 7 years. And then in verse 3, at the end of the 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to the king to beg for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and had said, tell me about all the great things Elisha had done. And so he points to the woman and says, this is the one whose son had been raised. So she is taken care of then by the king. In chapter 8, verses 7 through 15, we are told about the murder of Ben-Hadad. He is the king of Aram. He was ill, and since Elisha had gone to that region, a messenger is sent to him, Hazael, to see if he would recover. In verse 10, Elisha said, go and say to him, you will certainly recover. But the Lord has revealed to me that he will in fact die. And so then when Hazael took the information back, he said that you will recover. But then the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it with water, spread it over the king's face so that he died. Then Hazael succeeded him as king, just as Elisha said it would happen. Jehoram becomes the king of Judah. Chapter 8, verse 16, 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, when Jehoshaphat was king of Judah, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, began his reign as king of Judah. 32 years old when he became king, he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, as the house of Ahab had done, for he had married a daughter of Ahab. So he is condemned because he goes the way of the northern kings. And then it says in verse 20, in the time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king. In chapter 8 and verse 25, in the 12th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old. When he became king, he reigned in Jerusalem 1 year. His mother's name was Athaliah, a granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab and did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Ahaziah went with Joram, the son of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram. King Joram was wounded, and he returned to Jezreel to recover. Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to Israel to see Joram, son of Ahab, because he had been wounded. Now this is when we have the exploits of Jehu, the one who becomes king of Israel. This is one of the things that Elijah was supposed to do, and it falls to Elisha. In chapter 9, verse 1, the prophet Elisha summoned a man from the company of the prophets and said to him, "Tuck your cloak into your belt, take this flask of oil with you, and go to Ramoth Gilead. When you get there, look for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi." And then he is to tell him that he is to wipe out the family of Ahab. In verse 7, "You are to destroy the house of Ahab your master, and I will avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel." So Jehu then is proclaimed king by the soldiers in his camp. He is in Ramoth Gilead, and this is on a trade route where two trade routes cross. It's a very important place, and both Aram and Israel tried to keep possession of it. So Jehu then goes to Jezreel. In verse 14 of chapter 9, Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. In verse 17, when the lookout standing on the tower in Jezreel saw Jehu's troops approaching, he called out, "I see some troops coming." So Joram ordered that a messenger go out and see why they are coming. And Jehu merely told him, "Turn around and travel with me." So a second messenger is sent. Same thing happens. He turns around and rides with Jehu. And then they recognize it as the driving of Jehu. He drives furiously. Then the king had his own chariot hitched up, and he went out to meet him at the plot that had belonged to Naboth the Jezreelite. Joram realized it was a coup, and he tries to escape, but Jehu shoots him with an arrow. And then he tells his men to pick him up and throw him on the field that belonged to Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember how you and I were riding together in chariots behind Ahab his father when the Lord made this prophecy about him. "Yesterday I saw the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons, declares the Lord, and I will surely make you pay for it on this plot of ground, declares the Lord." So they threw him then on that plot of ground. Ahaziah, the king of Judah, when he sees what's happened, he tries to escape, and he fled up the road to Beth Hagan, but it says that Jehu chased him and shot him too. He escaped to Megiddo, but he died there, and then he was taken back to Jerusalem. Jehu went to Jezreel. In chapter 9, verse 30, when Jezebel heard about it, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out of a window. As Jehu entered the gate, she asked, "Have you come in peace, Zimri?" you murderer of your master. Of course, Zimri was one of those previous kings who had assassinated his king and took his place. And so Jehu looks up and he tells the eunuchs to throw her down. And so they threw her down, and her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses as they trampled her underfoot. Then he went in and ate and drank. Decided, well, it's time to bury Jezebel. So he gave that order, but only thing left was the hands and feet. The rest of it were eaten by dogs. And this is also, according to the prophet's word, Jezebel's body will be like refuse on the ground in the plot of Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, this is Jezebel. Now, all of the family of Ahab then is killed. There are 70 sons being raised by elders in the city. Jehu sends a letter to them saying, choose one of them and make him king and come fight against me. But they know they can't fight against Jehu. And so he says, okay, if you're with me, cut off the heads of all of those relatives and send them in baskets to me. So this is what they did. In verse 11, Jehu killed everyone in Jezreel who remained in the house of Ahab, as well as all his chief men, his close friends, and his priests, leaving him no survivor. And then he went to Samaria, and he took care of all of those who were there as well. And they met some people coming from Judah who were planning on visiting the king. There were 42 of them, and it says that they took them alive, this is in verse 14, and slaughtered them by the well of Beth Eked, 42 men. He left no survivors. And then he meets Jonadab, the son of Rechab, who was on his way to meet him. He takes him up into his chariot and shows him how much he is in favor of wiping out Baal in Samaria. Beginning with verse 18, Jehu summoned all the worshippers of Baal to come to the temple of Baal. And he wanted to be sure that there were no worshippers of Yahweh there. And then it says in verse 25, as soon as Jehu had finished making the burnt offering, he ordered the guards and officers, go in and kill them, let no one escape. So they cut them down with the sword. The guards and officers threw the bodies out and then entered the inner shrine of the temple of Baal. They brought the sacred stone out of the temple of Baal, burned it. They demolished the sacred stone, tore down the temple, and people have used it for a latrine to this day. So Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. But we're also told in verse 28, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, the worship of the golden calves at Bethel and Dan. So he was not as thorough in his cleansing as he should have been. And we are also told in verse 32, in those days the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel. Hazael overpowered the Israelites throughout their territory east of the Jordan in all the land of Gilead, the region of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, from Aurora by the Arnon Gorge through Gilead to Bashan. Now the text takes us back to Judah. We know that the king has been killed by Jehu, And Athaliah, when she realizes that her son has been killed, she proceeds to kill all of the royal family. Only one was left, and that is Joash, the son of Ahaziah. And that was taken by the sister of Ahaziah and put with a nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah. Joash lived for 6 years in the temple of the Lord. And at the end of the 6 years, when Joash was 7, the high priest Jehoiada scheduled a coup. He had the Levites all as participants in this. He had them come on duty. He had Joash brought out to stand in the place of the king. A crown was put on his head. The people all shouted, "Long live the king." Athaliah heard this noise, and she came to the temple, and she saw the king standing by the pillar. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her robes and cried out, "Treason! Treason!" But they took her out of the temple and killed her. And so the king then was placed on the throne. And while he is a minor, Jehoiada really rules the land. And that is fortunate for Judah. Now Josiah is a good king as long as Jehoiada lives. But then after the death of Jehoiada, then Joash is influenced by some of his friends, and he becomes a bad king. There is a need to repair the temple every once in a while, and so Joash does this. In chapter 12, nothing had been done with the money that had been collected. So Joash summoned Jehoiada the priest and asked, "Why aren't you repairing the damage?" And so a chest was taken, a hole was bored in the top so that people could drop money into it, and it was put at the entrance to the temple of the Lord. And whenever there was a sufficient amount of money in the chest, it was taken out, counted, and appointed to the men who did the work. In verse 14 of chapter 12, it says, "It was paid to the workmen who used it to repair the temple. They did not require an accounting from those to whom they gave the money to pay the workers, because they acted with complete honesty." And so the temple was repaired. As for the other events of Joash in verse 19, his officials conspired against him and assassinated him at Beth Milo on the road down to Silla. The officials who murdered him were Jozabad, son of Shemeath, and Jehozabad, son of Shomer. He died and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Amaziah, his son, succeeded him as king. In chapter 13, in the 23rd year of Joash, the son of Ahaziah, king of Judah, Jehoahaz, son of Jehu, became king in Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 17 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord by following the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, and he did not turn away from them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and for a long time he kept them under the power of Hazael, king of Aram, and Ben-Hadad, his son. And then we are told that Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor. Now he is a king of the northern tribes. And it says, the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram was oppressing Israel. The Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they escaped from the power of Aram. So the Israelites lived in their own homes as they had before. But they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam. Now this was their opportunity. God had intervened for them, but they didn't do what they should have. In chapter 13, verse 10, in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 16 years. Now you notice we have Joash and Jehoash. They are the same name. It's just that they spell one way and one the other to distinguish them. But it is the same name. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It says that Jehoash rested with his fathers, and Jeroboam succeeded him on the throne. Jehoash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. Now we are introduced to Elisha once again in chapter 13, verse 14. Now Elisha was suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. my father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." You remember that is what Elisha said when Elijah was taken from him. Elisha said, "Get a bow and some arrows," and he did. So the king is told to shoot an arrow out of the window to the east. He did this. And then Elisha says, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. And then he said to take the arrows that are left and strike the ground with them. And he did it for 3 times and then stopped. And Elisha said, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times. And we are told about those 3 times when he had a battle with Aram and defeated them. Now an interesting comment is made in verse 20 that Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. And when the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Now that is a miracle that is attributed to Elisha. This enables him to have twice as many miracles as Elijah. But we may not be told all that they did. So this is not to be used as a proof that double portion means twice as much. It only means heirship. In verse 24, Hazael, king of Aram, died. Ben-Hadad, his son, succeeded him as king. Then Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, recaptured from Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, the towns he had taken in battle from his father Jehoahaz. 3 times Jehoash defeated him, and so he recovered the Israelite towns. Now that fulfills the prophecy about hitting the ground with the arrows 3 times. Then we have Amaziah of Judah in chapter 14. In the 2nd year of Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Jehoiadin. She was from Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not as his father David had done. In everything he followed the example of his father Joash. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Notice how the evaluation is done. As close to David as possible, or somewhat near David. In verse 7, he defeated 10,000 Edomites in the valley of Salt and captured Selah in battle. Amaziah sent messengers to Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, king of Israel. He wants to meet him in battle, but this is a very bad choice. The king of Israel warns him, don't do this. But he does it anyway. He is defeated by the king of Israel. And it's interesting that there is this saying, a thistle in Lebanon sent a message to a cedar in Lebanon, give your daughter to my son in marriage. Then a wild beast in Lebanon came along and trampled the thistle underfoot. So he says that's what's going to happen to you. And this is what has happened. Amaziah was captured at Beit Shemesh. This is in the Judah territory to the south. And then Jehoash went to Jerusalem, broke down the wall of Jerusalem from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate, a section about 600 feet long. He took all the gold and silver and all the articles found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. He also took hostages and returned to Samaria. While he is captured in the northern kingdom, that his son reigns in Judah, and this is Hezekiah. In verse 17 of chapter 14, says, Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, lived for 15 years after the death of Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. And then as for the other events of Amaziah's reign, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? They conspired against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish, or Lachish, and they sent men after him to Lachish and killed him there. And then he was buried in Jerusalem with his fathers in the city of David. And then all of the people took Azariah, who was 16 years old, and he's also called Uzziah, and he made him king in place of his father Amaziah. He is the one who rebuilt Elat and restored it to Judah after Amaziah rested with his fathers. Then we have Jeroboam the second of Israel in chapter 14, verse 23. Jeroboam is the one who restored the northern kingdom to its largest extent. He and Uzziah in Judah extended the territory as much as the kingdom of Solomon. In verse 25, he was the one who restored the boundaries of Israel from Lebo Hamath to the sea of the Arabah, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of Amittai, the prophet from Gath Hepher. Now he is the one who was sent to Assyria to speak about Nineveh. And then the other events of Jeroboam's reign are written in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel. Jeroboam rested with his fathers, the kings of Israel, and Zechariah, his son, succeeded him as king. In chapter 15, in the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, son of Amaziah, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 16 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 52 years. His mother's name was Jechaliah. She was from Jerusalem. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Amaziah had done. But then in verse 5 it says that the Lord afflicted the king with leprosy until the day he died, and he lived in a separate house. Jotham, the king's son, had charge of the palace and governed the people of the land. Again, it says of Azariah that he did not remove the high places. So again, a good king, but not good enough. In verse 8 of chapter 15, Zechariah becomes king of Israel, and he lasts only for 6 months. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as his fathers had done. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. Shallum, son of Jabesh, conspired against Zechariah. He struck him down in front of the people, assassinated him, and succeeded him as king. So the word of the Lord that was spoken to Jehu is fulfilled. Your descendants will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation. And now begins the 6th dynasty in Israel with Shallum. And he reigned 1 month. Menachem, son of Gadi, went from Tirzah up to Samaria. He attacked Shallum, son of Jabesh, in Samaria, assassinated him, and succeeded him as king. So Menachem begins dynasty 7 in Israel. What Shallum did in that 1 month is written in the annals of the kings of Israel. You can't think that he did much in that length of time. And then in verse 17, we have Menachem, who becomes king of Israel, and he reigned 10 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. During his entire reign, he did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. Then Pul, P-U-L. This is another name for Tiglath-Pileser, the king of the Assyrians. He invaded the land, and Menachem gave him 1,000 talents of silver to gain his support and strengthen his own hold on the kingdom. Menachem exacted this money from Israel. Every wealthy man had to contribute 50 shekels of silver to be given to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria withdrew and stayed in the land no longer. Menachem then died. What he did is written in the annals of the kings of Israel. And Pekahiah, his son, succeeded him as king. Now Menachem was the 7th dynasty. We have Pekahiah in verse 23. He became king. He reigned 2 years. And he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And one of his chief officers, Pekah, son of Ramaliah, conspired against him. Taking 50 men of Gilead with him, he assassinated Pekahiah along with Argob and Ariah in the citadel of the royal palace at Samaria. So Pekah killed Pekahiah and succeeded him as king, and began the 8th dynasty in Israel. In verse 28, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit. In the time of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, the same one that's called Pul, came and took Ion, Abel-Beth-Maacah, Genoa, Kadesh, and Hatzor. He took Gilead and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria. Then Hoshea, son of Elah, conspired against Pekah, son of Ramaliah. He attacked and assassinated him, and then succeeded him as king in the 20th year of Jotham, son of Uzziah. So Hoshea then begins dynasty 9, the last dynasty in Israel. In chapter 15 and verse 32, we're introduced to Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah. He was 25 years old, and he reigned 16 years. His mother's name was Jerusha, daughter of Zadok. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. The high places, however, were not removed. The people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jotham rebuilt the upper gate of the temple of the Lord. And then he died and was buried in the city of David. And Ahaz, his son, succeeded him as king. Chapter 16 tells us about Ahaz. Ahaz was not a good king. It's in the 17th year of Pekah, son of Ramaliah. Ahaz began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and even sacrificed his son in the fire, following the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. Then Rezin, king of Aram, and Pekah, son of Ramaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem and besieged Ahaz. Now this is told for us in the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah tells him to trust in the Lord and ask a sign from the Lord, but Ahaz won't do it. Rezin, king of Aram, recovered a lot for Aram by driving out the men of Judah. Edomites then moved into Elat and have lived there to this day. Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser. Instead of trusting in God, he trusts in the Assyrian king. So he asked Tiglath-Pileser to come and to attack Israel, thinking that he will be free. But it merely means that he becomes a vassal of the Assyrians as well. Ahaz went to Damascus, verse 10, to meet Tiglath-Pileser. And there is an altar there that he copies, sends the plans to Jerusalem, and a new altar is built to replace the altar of burnt sacrifices. So this also is evil. In verse 12, when the king came back from Damascus and saw the altar, he approached it and presented offerings on it. He offered up his burnt offering and grain offerings, poured out his drink offerings, and sprinkled the blood of his fellowship offerings on the altar. The bronze altar that stood before the Lord, he brought from the front of the temple, from between the new altar and the temple of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the new altar. He is going to use that altar for divination. There are other changes that Ahaz made to the temple as well to please the king of Assyria. In chapter 17, Hoshea is mentioned again, the son of Elat. He's the one that began the 9th dynasty, and he is the last king of Israel. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore Shalmaneser seized him, put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, laid siege to it for 3 years, and in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah, in Gozan, on the Habor River, and in the towns of the Medes. Now the rest of chapter 17 tells us why God had done this. They had failed to worship him. And in verse 7 it says, all this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices which the kings of Israel had introduced. Baal worship was one of those. Samaria is resettled with other people. Those people who were living in Samaria were taken east to Assyria, and it's mentioned Halah, Gazon, and the towns of the Medes. And then other people were brought from Babylon, Cuthath, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. And when they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord, so he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. So it's reported to the king of Assyria that they have to do something about the lions. And so they take one of the priests who had been taken into exile, send him back, and he is to teach the people how to worship the God of the land. In verse 29, nevertheless, each national group made its own gods in the several towns which they settled, and set them up in the shrines the people of Israel had made at the high places. Now, traditionally, these people are now called Samaritans. They are a mixture of any Israelites who were left in the land and the new people who are brought in from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. Now we go to Hezekiah, a king of Judah, and it says that it was in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old, and he became king and reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. Sennacherib threatens Jerusalem during the time of Hezekiah. Hezekiah had revolted against him, and Sennacherib came and captured 48 of the fortified cities in Judah, and he was not able to take Jerusalem. And this is actually recorded on the prism of Sennacherib, how that he had devastated the land, and the last city he took was Lachish. And on the palace in the east, in Assyria, you have a wall relief that pictures the capture of Lachish. Chapters 18 and 19 talk about the deliverance of the city of Jerusalem. And again, Isaiah is involved in that. Hezekiah became sick, and he was about to die. He is visited by Isaiah, chapters 20. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz, went to him and said, "This is what the Lord says, put your house in order, because you will die, you will not recover." But Hezekiah turned his face to the wall and cried, and he reminded the Lord of what good he had done, and he didn't want to die. And so God changed his mind and allowed Hezekiah 15 more years. However, that sickness led to a get well card from the Babylonians. And they come, and Hezekiah shows them everything in his palace. And when Isaiah came to him and asked what they had seen, he says that I showed them everything. Chapter 20 of 2 Kings, verse 16, Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, that will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," Hezekiah replied. For he thought, "Will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?" Now, as a grandfather, I would never have made that statement. We want what is best for our children, and what he has done is he has plunged them into slavery to the Babylonians. Then Hezekiah rested with his fathers, and Manasseh his son succeeded him as king.